Let's bring in Claire Finkelstein, Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, for more on this current situation. Professor Finkelstein, thanks for being with us here in France 24. I'm looking forward to hearing your views and your analysis. What's happened in Venezuela? Is it legal?
Unfortunately, it's not legal at all. It's not legal under international law, and it's not legal under U.S. law because of the failure to consult Congress under circumstances that were not emergency. Under international law, it's a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It's an illegal use of force. There was not a basis for engaging in a use of force under these circumstances, given that it was not an emergency self-defense situation or an emergency defense of another country. There was no universal right of self-defense being exercised. The Trump administration has said repeatedly that it had to defend against a narco-terrorist regime that was flooding the country with drugs, but in fact, it is cocaine, not fentanyl, and our problem has been fentanyl. And the cocaine trafficking that Venezuela is arguably at the bottom of is mostly going to other countries, is not coming into the U.S. So there isn't really a basis for any kind of self-defense claim. And the self-defense would have to be imminent or give rise to an immediate need for the use of force. And that just wasn't the case here. And on the American side, there was no basis for not having informed Congress in advance. And so it's really a violation of Congress's war powers, which under the U.S. Constitution has the sole right to declare war under the U.S. Constitution.
So Nicolas Maduro has appeared in court. He's pleaded not guilty. Is there any possibility, given what you've just told us and clearly explained to us, that one day Donald Trump might find himself in court?
Well, the whole point about international law is that it's reciprocal and that all countries are equal under international law. So what goes for one sovereign state goes for another sovereign state. The fact that one country is more powerful and can get away with the use of force doesn't mean that they have a right to do it under international law. So technically, if Donald Trump is going to argue, or the Trump administration is going to argue that it has a right to kidnap presidents from another sovereign state and haul them in for trial, then in theory, another sovereign state would have the right to do that to the United States president. And I don't think that's a direction that the Trump administration wants to go in.
But is, in a sense, Professor Finkelstein, is Donald Trump thinking of himself as being above the law? Is that where we are right now?
That's where we've been with this president. And of course, as far as U.S. courts go, the U.S. Supreme Court in Trump v. United States has declared him above U.S. law and says that he has immunity for official capacity acts. And so he does believe himself to be above the law, and I think he's really feeling his oats with this military action, which in the first Trump administration he was restrained from engaging in. He had people around him who were kind of guardrails on his presidency that he doesn't have in this administration. So Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth are really willing to aid and abet this kind of conduct. And so in the last few hours, he's been talking about Greenland and Colombia and putting a lot of fear into those countries and into other countries. And let's not forget, of course, that Greenland is a part of Denmark, which is a member of NATO. So he's really courting some extremely dangerous action there.
Interesting that someone who himself has been convicted, and he is the first ever US president to have a criminal record, thinks of himself as being above the law, but you've brilliantly pointed out exactly where the situation is and why we are here. And I'm wondering, with the so-called Monroe Doctrine, as he's christened it, the sort of modern interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, if that too is illegal, what he's actually sort of contemplating there, because back in 1823, when James Monroe came up with this concept, there were, of course, a different set of laws, a different international order in many ways. You could kind of, I suppose, hit the high seas and act as you saw fit for your country's interests. We live in a very different world now, don't we? A world of so-called democracies.
Yeah, let's not forget that the Monroe Doctrine is not law. It's a political doctrine about Western hegemony. And it's clearly not an acceptable doctrine in a modern world. We don't want to give the equivalent of the Monroe Doctrine to Vladimir Putin and say that he can control all the former Soviet bloc countries, even though that's exactly what he's trying to do. So we don't accept the equivalent of the Monroe Doctrine for any other part of the world. And there's no basis for us to accept it here. And when Hitler marched into the Sudetenland and took over part of Czechoslovakia, it was a similar kind of thinking. It's aggressive war, it's takeover of another sovereign nation, and you can put whatever sort of face you want on that kind of takeover, but it's a violation of international sovereignty. And the whole idea of Westphalian states and the modern era is that you can't violate another state's sovereignty without having a legal justification based in self-defense.
Professor Finkelstein, I've got so many questions. I'm going to go for this one. The message clearly that has been given to the likes of Xi Jinping, the likes of Vladimir Putin, is that if Donald Trump can do exactly what he wants to do in what he sees as his own backyard, then they can do the same in theirs.
Well, and that's the grave concern. That's the concern about Ukraine, which is that Donald Trump and Putin, who have been talking, may have made some sort of implicit deal. That's something, by the way, that Fiona Hill testified to in Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, that there may have been an implicit back and forth, and she even testified on that with regard to Venezuela. Don't tread on my backyard and I won't tread on yours. So is Donald Trump pulling back on Ukraine because he's trying to make sure that Russia doesn't interfere with our takeover of Venezuela and possibly other Latin or South American countries? That's the concern, and that's really not international law. It's an anti-law doctrine, and as you pointed out, it's very antiquated. It's from a different era in our past, and it has no place in the modern world.
So in terms of what happens next, Donald Trump, as you were alluding to earlier, Professor Finkelstein, talking about the possibility of taking Greenland, talking about the possibility of doing the same thing to Colombia as he's done to Venezuela, and also talking about Cuba. If that happens, What does the world do apart from hold its breath?
Right, and it will be much more difficult for him to do that. So first of all, let's start with non-NATO countries. I mean, Colombia's president is not in the same position as Maduro. So he is talking about a man who has been a dictator, who has engaged in heinous acts, criminal acts, and that's where he gets a little bit of support and a little bit of color to this action. The problem will be in the way that he got into court. So the indictment that he was charged with defines real crimes, but the way that you go about that, and his administration keeps stressing that this is not a war, this is a law enforcement action, would be to demand extradition. And there is an extradition treaty with Venezuela, though Venezuela doesn't always pay attention to that and doesn't always abide by it. But normally when you have a law enforcement matter, you should proceed by extradition, not by invasion. Once you're starting to talk about military action and kidnapping heads of states, and you're talking about people who may not have engaged in criminal action, certainly where Greenland is concerned, we're not going to have the same kind of profile by any means. He's going to have a lot more difficulty, and where it's a NATO country, the NATO countries are going to be obligated under the NATO treaty to defend Greenland. And so we're really courting World War III there. They have a solemn obligation under international law, and they can't let him ride roughshod over that agreement and over the NATO compact. So it's an extremely dangerous game that he's playing, and waiting to see if anyone is going to stop him.
Professor Claire Finkelstein of the University of Pennsylvania, Professor of Law, thank you very much for your very clear explanations of where we are right now regarding the situation with Venezuela and beyond, and Donald Trump's ambitions. Dr. Claire Finkelstein of the University of Pennsylvania, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.